You can take your coffee pot, old woman. We don't need you anymore. Colin didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He said it like a man giving instructions to a stranger at a gas station casual. Detached. Behind him, Lacey leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Lips curled in what she likely thought was a neutral expression. It wasn't. It was satisfaction. I stood there for a second, not because I didn't hear him, but because I needed my body to catch up with what my mind had already understood. Just days ago, I'd signed the deed. I'd sat at the dining room table, right under the light fixture I chose 15 years ago, and handed over my home. Colin had smiled then. Lacey had poured sparkling water like we were celebrating a birthday. Now my name was gone from the papers, and I was gone from their lives. I didn't say a word, just turned and walked past the living room where my crocheted blankets had been folded and stacked neatly into a box, past the shelf where the photo of my late husband used to sit. Removed, my hands didn't shake, but I felt the weight in my chest, pressing like a stone with every step. In the kitchen, I saw the coffee pot still sitting in its spot. I unplugged it gently, wrapped the cord around the base, and placed it in the padded tote I'd used during road trips. My mugs were already gone. I opened a cabinet. Empty. They'd packed for me. Back in the hallway, Colin was tapping his phone. Lacey was scrolling hers. Neither of them looked up. The silence felt planned, practiced. I picked up the small overnight bag I'd kept in the coat closet. I'd packed it last week before signing anything, just in case. Without a word, I stepped outside. The air felt sharper than it should. My rideshare was already waiting at the curb. I got in, closed the door, and watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. I didn't ask where we were going. I already knew. I bought that house with what was left of our retirement account after Martin died. It wasn't fancy 3 bedrooms, modest yard, but it had wide windows that let the morning sun touch every corner of the kitchen. And that's what sold me. Martin used to say, light meant hope. I needed that after he was gone. Colin was 20 then, still in college, still grieving. He came home on weekends, and we'd eat at the little table by the window. Just the two of us and the coffee pot between us. I'd cook too much, and he'd pretend to be hungrier than he was. That house made me feel like I could still mother someone, even when everything else felt hollow. Over the years, I hosted every Thanksgiving there, every birthday. Colin brought girlfriends, then brought Lacey, and eventually brought a question. Would I co-sign his business loan? He had a plan, a partner, and I wanted to believe in him. So I said yes. I always said yes. When that first business failed and the debt piled up, I tightened my budget. No travel, no new shoes, no dining out. I never complained. He said he'd pay it back. He said he just needed time. When he and Lacey said they were struggling to afford rent, I offered the spare room. It was supposed to be temporary just until they got back on their feet. I moved my sewing machine into the garage to give them more space. Then Lacey moved in her dresser. Then her china hutch. Then her way of speaking to me like I was the tenant. The kitchen started to feel less mine. The thermostat was always set higher than I liked. They stopped asking before hosting dinner parties. Then they stopped telling me at all. They never yelled. They just made decisions without me. Until I no longer felt like the owner of anything, not even my chair at the table. So, when they asked about the deed, said it would help them refinance. Said it was just paperwork, it almost felt inevitable. And yet, I still said yes. It started over coffee. The kind of quiet morning that once felt like routine. Lacey sat across from me with a notepad and a practiced smile. Colin wasn't there. He had left early for a meeting, she said. But he'd been meaning to bring this up. She talked about refinancing, interest rates, consolidating debt, how my name on the deed made things a little tricky with the underwriters. She spoke like it was all too technical for me to worry about. Then came the line. It would really just simplify things if the house were under one name. I didn't answer right away. That night, Colin came home with a six-pack of the local brew he knew I liked and offered to grill dinner. He sat next to me on the patio, told me I'd always have a room in the house. It's still your home. Mom, this is just for the bank, he said. Nothing changes. I wanted to believe him, and I did, because even after everything, I still wanted to believe he wouldn't use me. So I signed. The next day, they changed the Wi-Fi password. 2 days later, Lacey asked if I could text before using the laundry, since her schedule was tight lately. By the end of the week, Colin casually mentioned they were thinking of changing the locks just for safety. He said, then added, "You'll still have a key." Of course. The night after that, Lacey left a small envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a brochure for a nearby independent living complex. No note. Just a sticky tab on the page that read, 1 bedroom, garden view. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask why. I just sat with it in my lap. The paper warmed from my hands. Colin came into the kitchen later, kissed my forehead, and said, "You've done so much for us. We just want you to be able to relax now." I nodded, folded the brochure, and placed it in the drawer with the warranties and the emergency contact list. That night, I packed a small overnight bag and hid it in the coat closet. I've spent years sitting across from people who smiled too wide while sliding papers across the table. Back in my nonprofit days, I reviewed grant applications, budget proposals, and contracts that always had something missing in the margins. I learned to read between lines, to track what wasn't being said. Lacey's tone, her sudden interest in property tax codes. It all felt familiar. She'd asked about exemptions one afternoon, pretending it was for a neighbor. Then she brought up home equity, wondering aloud what people like me do when they need to access funds in retirement. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about paperwork. It was about ownership. So before I signed anything, I called Evelyn Hunt. Evelyn and I went to college together. She'd gone on to become a real estate attorney in Dallas, and I hadn't spoken to her in years. But when I explained the situation, she didn't even hesitate. "Bring everything," she said. "We'll write it our way." We met in her office on a Wednesday. I handed over the draft deed Colin had emailed. Evelyn read it once, frowned, and then started typing. By the time I left, the new version was airtight. The house title would transfer, yes, but with a conditional survivorship clause buried in the footnotes. In plain terms, it meant any major financial action sale, refinance, transfer would require my notarized approval until my death or voluntary release. Not that they'd notice. Lacey always skimmed. I signed that version in front of a notary Evelyn trusted, with copies sent to the county recorder's office and one sealed in my own file cabinet. They thought I gave it away, but I didn't. I let them hold it just long enough to show me who they were, so when Colin changed the locks and Lacey handed me that brochure, I didn't panic. I waited, because the difference between surrender and strategy is silence. And I'd learned how to sit still longer than most people could stay cruel. The night I left, I took only what I needed because I already had everything that mattered. The rideshare arrived just after sunset. Colin didn't help me with the bags. He stood at the top of the steps, arms folded, offering one last thanks for everything. Mom. Like he was closing a transaction. Lacey didn't come outside. I wheeled 2 suitcases to the curb. One held clothes, the other carried documents, old photos, and the coffee pot. I left the framed memories, the antique dresser, the hand-stitched quilt from my mother. I left the home, not the weight of what it had meant. The car was quiet. The driver didn't ask questions. That was a relief. The rental house was smaller than the guest room I'd just been evicted from. One bedroom, beige walls, faint scent of old paint. The kind of place designed for people in transition, people who didn't unpack all the way. I placed my bags by the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged slightly beneath me. But I barely noticed. In my hand were 2 sets of keys. One was to this rental. The other I'd carried for 4 years without ever using. I had bought a duplex across town after Martin died, paid in cash, titled under the name of a trust I'd quietly created during my last year working in finance. Back then, I didn't know exactly what I was protecting myself from. I just knew it was wise to have a second door. Now, that second door was my first step. I didn't cry. I unpacked the coffee pot, filled the filter, pressed brew, not for comfort, but clarity. I'd been letting them steer too long, but I'd never once forgotten how to drive. While the machine hummed, I pulled out a file folder marked Hunt Legal. Evelyn's number was still at the top. They thought they'd taken everything. They hadn't even scratched the surface. In the morning, I would call a locksmith not for the house I left, but for the one they didn't know existed. It didn't take long. Within 10 days of my departure, the house was listed. Not in their names. Of course, they were smarter than that. Or at least they thought they were. The listing showed a limited liability company out of Dallas. Shell entity. Clean website. No trace of Colin or Lacey on the surface. But I'd seen that tactic too many times to be impressed. They had it priced high. Just under $1 million. I knew what they'd paid nothing. Every dollar they hoped to make would be pure profit. 500,000, maybe more. If the market stayed hot, that house was going to fund their next chapter, and they were writing me out of it completely. Too bad they skipped the footnotes. I watched it all from the comfort of my small duplex on a second-hand laptop I'd kept tucked away for backup. Evelyn had set up a property records alert system for me years ago, and sure enough, the notification came through as soon as the LLC filed a preliminary contract. New title activity detected, 1181 Haven Crest Lane. The name made my stomach turn, but I didn't flinch. I opened the county site, pulled up the document, and smiled. They hadn't even read the filing requirements. The survivorship clause Evelyn inserted was still active and legally binding. Any attempt to sell without my notarized approval would trigger an automatic flag in the title system. Even if they found a buyer, they couldn't close. The irony. All they had to do was ask. All they had to do was treat me like a person instead of a stepping stone. But they didn't. And now they were about to learn what happens when greed moves faster than comprehension. I opened a fresh document, typed a short notice to the title company, attached the original deed with the highlighted clause, and hit send. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee, clicked on the listing one more time, and waited for the call. I didn't make an appointment. I walked in just after 10, when the front desk was still quiet and the coffee in their waiting area was still fresh. The receptionist offered me a clipboard. I gave her a file folder instead. "I'm here about a pending sale," I said. She blinked, took the folder, and disappeared down the hall without another word. Minutes later, a closing officer named Travis called me into his office. Young, polite, sharp suit. The kind of professional who expected a little old lady to bring cookies, not legal ammunition. He smiled when he gestured for me to sit. That smile didn't last long. I laid the original deed on his desk and slid over the letter from Evelyn's office. "Page 4, Clause 7, I said. He read, his brow furrowed. "Survivorship condition," he muttered. "Requires your notarized consent for any legal sale." I nodded. They never got it. Then I pulled out my phone and hit play. Colin's voice came through clearly, even in the quiet office. "Yeah. Man." She signed it. Didn't even read the fine print. "We're gonna flip this thing and be out in 6 months. Tops." Travis shifted in his chair. "I assume the buyer doesn't know this part," I said. He shook his head slowly. "No, but they're going to..." I reached into my bag and pulled out one last envelope sealed, addressed in clean black ink. Give them this. Before they waste time filing a lawsuit. He took it without a word. I stood, thanked him, and left without looking back. Outside, the breeze hit my face, warm and steady. I walked to my car like I had just returned from a grocery run. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. But inside that office, a plan was already unraveling. And back at my duplex, a second kettle was already whistling on the stove. It started with a call from the title company to the buyer. Then it spread like spilled ink fast, permanent, and impossible to contain. Within 48 hours, the pending sale was flagged for legal review. The buyer's attorney filed a fraud complaint with the county clerk's office. That same day, the bank initiated a temporary freeze on the LLC's account, pending investigation. Colin and Lacey must have thought they could spin it, maybe blame it on a clerical error. But the recording was now part of the record. So was the deed. So was my statement. Signed and notarized. By the end of the week, Lacey's name appeared in the complaint summary attached to the public filing. A local blogger picked it up. And then, somehow, so did her firm. Her profile disappeared from their website by noon the next day. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. But I did sit by the window, watching morning light fall across the floorboards of my little duplex. And when the phone rang that afternoon, I already knew who it was. Colin's voice cracked before the first sentence ended. Mom, why would you do this to us? I let the silence sit for a beat. Then I said, I didn't. You did. He tried again. Softer this time. We didn't think you'd escalate. As if protecting myself was an overreaction. As if deception deserved silence in return. I gave you everything. I said. I signed. I trusted. I believed you when you said it was still my home. He didn't respond. You turned a promise into a loophole. You sold the roof I built with my bare hands for a profit you didn't earn. Another silence. We can fix this, he said finally. No, I said. You can clean it up. That's different. I hung up before he could say more. In the kitchen, the kettle let out a soft hiss. I poured a fresh cup and sat down to read through the buyer's updated filing. They'd named Colin and Lacey directly, and they weren't the only ones watching. The house was quiet when I opened the door. The lock clicked differently, now changed back to the old set I'd kept in my desk drawer for years. I stepped inside slowly. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the stillness to speak first. They were gone. No note, no apology, just absence. The furniture was theirs, modern, sharp, cold, but the soul of the place, the warmth it once carried, had been left behind in the baseboards and beneath the paint. I walked through each room like I was revisiting an old photograph, familiar, faded, and full of things I still remembered by heart. In the kitchen, I cleared the counter, wiped it clean with a towel from the drawer I'd stocked myself a decade ago. Then I pulled my old coffee pot from the canvas tote, set it in its rightful spot beneath the cabinet, and plugged it in. It still fit. I moved through the hallway, pausing at the framed canvas that used to hold their wedding photo. The nail was still there. I removed it gently and left the wall bare. In the master bedroom, I opened the closet and found a single wire hanger swinging slowly, as if something had just been taken down. I opened my satchel, pulled out a wooden frame wrapped in soft linen, and placed it on the dresser. Colin, at 5 years old, gap-toothed, holding a red balloon, arms raised like the whole world was waiting to hug him back. I stared at that photo for a long time. My hand reached for the frame, but stopped short. I didn't need to touch it to remember the weight of him at that age, the way he leaned into me, the way he trusted me to catch him every time. I whispered. I raised him. I didn't lose him. He lost me. Then I turned off the light, walked back to the kitchen, and brewed a fresh pot. There was one more thing left to do before I closed this chapter for good. I didn't stay. The house was clean, quiet, and finally mine again. But I had no desire to live in it. Some places, once bruised, never feel the same no matter how much you scrub the walls or open the windows. I didn't want to sleep under a roof that remembered too much. Instead, I called the director of a local women's shelter. We'd worked together years ago during my nonprofit days. I told her the house was hers, no strings, no rent. Just one request, that the plaque at the gate read, "The Martin Alcott Home." She cried. I didn't. I dropped off the keys the next morning, stood by the mailbox, and watched as her team walked through the front door with clipboards and quiet reverence. A new chapter would begin there, just not mine. I drove back to my duplex with the windows down. The neighbors were out front, waving like always. A boy on a scooter sped past my car, calling a cheerful, "Hi, Ms. Sabina," without slowing. I smiled and waved back. It wasn't much, but it felt like life. Inside, the kettle was already whistling. I poured a cup and carried it to my desk, where I'd laid out notebooks, old case files, and a new syllabus. Financial literacy for independent elders. 6 weeks. Free enrollment. Guest speakers from the state housing department. It was more than a project. It was a beginning. I opened a new folder, titled it Legacy, and added the first lesson plan. On the corner of my desk, beneath a paperweight shaped like a key, was a single handwritten note. They said they didn't need me, but now someone else does. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun stretch across the hardwood floors. It was strange how peace didn't always come from getting everything back. Sometimes it came from giving it to someone who still knew what it was worth.